My family arrived in February 4th, 1980 as refugees in Michigan. We had hardly any money. Growing up with so few Asians, the way you are treated by other students and friends, you know that you are naturally different. It was difficult growing up. There were moments when I wish I wasn't Asian. I was called chink and gook, and I remember times when there were kids on the neighborhood street who were not nice. And my family did face, a lot of discrimination.
I was born in Chicago, spent the first 4 years of my life there until we moved to Detroit, outside of Detroit, Michigan, about 30 minutes east of Detroit in a town called Sterling Heights, and that we jokingly call Sterling Whites while we were growing up. We were asked, where we were from, what kind of Indian we were. We were called all kinds of names, from wetback to camel jockey to the N-word, because people just didn't know who we were.
I was born in Seoul, Korea. I was one of those infants that didn't have any information. I was put into a baby home and then later a foster care home. And right around 6-9 months I came to the States. Because my family was not Asian American, they sided more with the Ibbins family. They were more the disgruntled, armchair, adamant family, like, oh, he got what he deserved, he shouldn't have been at the bar.
The Asian community was actually pretty small in Detroit, and there was an area called New Chinatown, which my great-grandfather opened up a restaurant there in 1940. It was the center of Chinatown. A lot of people would just swing by because you could always run into people there. We were famous for our egg rolls. I do remember when the incident occurred because, again, it's a small community, word travels fast. I vaguely remember being in the back of my parents' restaurant and someone coming in and saying that Vincent had just been attacked.
There was a black and white photo of an Asian man, and you never saw Asian people in the Detroit Free Press, let alone young, and let alone American. And I was so excited. But then as I read it, I was really saddened that he had been killed.
The only thing that I remember was actually seeing the wedding invitation on the kitchen counter and thinking, well, I guess we don't have to go to this event anymore. And when you're a little kid, you don't really think much about that kind of stuff. Probably when I first realized that this case was bigger than our community was in school, where the teachers, a couple of them, accidentally started calling me Vincent. So at that point, I got really annoyed, and I was thinking, wow, other people are actually hearing. So at that point, it kicked in my head that this was a news story that was beyond our community.
When I heard about the Vincent Chin case, suddenly I realized that there was a link. There was a link between being called chink and Jap and gook on the one hand, and being beaten to death with a baseball bat on the other hand.
The killing didn't attract much attention outside the Detroit area. Then a sentence was handed down last month, and now Bernard Goldberg explains why there is an explosion of outrage and sense of betrayal.
Is that sentence, the fact that no one was sent to prison for even one day, that has so many people outraged and charging that the two men who beat Vincent Chin to death literally got away with murder?
There's no law in this country, huh? Is it because they are Chinese?
Is that what you think?
I think that's what it is. Discrimination. We don't want that. We want justice.
For our generation, Vincent Chin was like a wake-up call. It was our loss of innocence. It was a public lynching that just horrified us.
Unfortunately, most people, Mrs. Chen, figured that the system would take care of itself, justice would be served, but as it turned out, being Asian doesn't mean much as far as the court system at that point in time.
Well, after the sentencing, there was an urgency, and there was the call to have that meeting at the Golden Star. There was a mixture of emotions. There was frustration about how unsatisfactory the probation and fine sentence was. And there was a resolve at the same time to get something done.
Early in the decision process, there was a debate as to whether or not to be typical Asians, passive, write letters, be polite about it, versus being vocal, going to the streets with protests, and making the case in the media. In the end, the decision was made to go public because we felt we had to fight and let everyone know the anger and the sense of injustice that we had suffered.
At the time, I was working for a Chinese language newspaper in New York City, And when we received the information over the AP wire service, we knew immediately that this was front page news.
At first, we started out with just maybe a dozen people who were journalists and lawyers in the Asian American community, and then it grew exponentially.
We want justice! We want justice! We want justice!
At the main rally in Hart Plaza, I took a bird's eye view looking down at the crowd, and without counting, I knew this was a huge outpouring of diverse people. I saw African Americans, I saw Pacific Islanders, Chinese, and Caucasians. I even spoke to a Filipino senior citizen who was marching, and I had asked him, why are you as a Filipino supporting this? And he says, if we don't stand together, we'll always be divided.
A lot of us were really inspired by the fact that 1,000 people in Michigan had protested this.
We joined this huge protest that was in San Francisco, Chinatown, and you couldn't fit all the people inside the Cameron House. There were people outside of it, and it was a powerful protest.
And it was just everybody was on the streets. In a very visceral, gut level feeling, there was a connection, and that was really something to see. I mean, I don't know that we've really seen anything like that since.
It was a major turning point for us. It was a signal that we needed to get more engaged in Pan-Asian activities, national activities. Even though this was in Detroit and I was in California, you got a sense that this is something that was affecting everybody across the country. And a lot of things came out of that particular movement, and it was a movement at the time. We saw the Vincent Chin case, a case where lots of different Asian Americans could get involved, whether they were Chinese American, Japanese American, Filipino American, first, second, third generation, that it was something that affected all of us.
It's hard to even imagine, I think, for people today what it was like then. The ethnic populations, whether Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean, Indian, Vietnamese, they were really so tiny. So the idea of people coming together to stand up, to build a movement together, to say that we stand against racism and against violence and hate crimes against Asian Americans had never been done before.
Before the Vincent Chin case, it's fair to say there weren't Asian Americans. There were Chinese Americans, there were Japanese Americans. There had been briefly in the 1960s a student movement on the West Coast.
When college students and activists came together, and we called ourselves Asian American.
But there wasn't a meaningful, abiding Asian American movement. It faltered. It didn't have an icon, a symbol. It didn't have a narrative that people could identify with.
The thing that was really amazing about the case was that people from diverse backgrounds, people who have never been to a protest rally in their entire lives, all of a sudden have this sudden outburst of energy and commitment to see that justice was done.
For the waiters and the restaurant workers and the chefs and the laundry workers and the engineers and the scientists, up until the 1980s, for them to come together and say, we are standing up as Asian Americans, that had never happened before.
The one thing that has pulled together through sheer concern all Asian Americans in this country and brought press and so forth from overseas and concern from overseas is the belief that Vincent Chin would be alive today if he were not Asian. And there is no question about that in any of our minds.
Do you think this trial would have occurred had not your group and other Asian Americans gotten involved and brought pressure to bear here and around the country?
I don't think any civil rights trial occurs unless there's pressure.
Vincent Chin murder just galvanized and motivated a lot of people to speak out even more than they were doing. Helen was an activist before that, but I think she became more involved in the Asian American community after that with the contacts that she made across the country. And I think Stuart Quo, who was always involved in Asian American issues since the start of the Asian American movement, came forward and stepped up and was able to help provide leadership.
We need our own stories of people. We don't have a lot of Jesse Jacksons in our community, but we do have a number of Lily Chins. When Mrs. Chin came to Los Angeles, she was talking at a very crowded Chinatown restaurant, and at one point she collapsed, and I helped her to her feet, and that night she was staying at our home.